Get on your knees. Now. The words didn't echo. They landed, heavy and immediate, cutting clean through the low hum of silverware and quiet conversations like a blade through glass. For a second, no one moved. The restaurant, warm with amber lighting, polished oak floors reflecting soft golden tones, and the faint scent of grilled steak and butter, seemed to hold its breath. At the center of it all stood Elijah Brooks. His coat, worn thin at the elbows, still carried the damp trace of rain from outside, small droplets clinging to the fabric like stubborn memories. His shoes were scuffed, the kind that had walked more miles than most people in the room could imagine. But it wasn't his clothes that drew the stares. It was the way he stood there, still, grounded, as if the weight of the moment had already passed through him before anyone else had time to feel it. Daniel Whitmore adjusted his cufflinks with a sharp, practiced motion, his posture straight, his jaw tight with the kind of control that came from years of managing appearances. "You heard me," he said again, quieter this time, but somehow heavier, like the air itself was pressing the command downward. A few guests shifted in their seats. Someone near the window paused mid-sip, glass hovering inches from their lips. Phones appeared, subtle at first, then more openly, as if people couldn't decide whether they were witnessing something uncomfortable or something worth capturing. Elijah didn't respond right away. His hands, weathered and steady, hung loosely at his sides. He glanced down for just a moment, not in submission, but as if checking something only he could see, then lifted his eyes again. They were calm, not defiant, not broken, just steady, the kind of steady that didn't ask for permission to exist. Daniel's voice sharpened. "You tracked dirt across the floor. You disrupted my guests. So you're going to show some respect." Respect. The word lingered strangely in the air, out of place against the quiet tension building in the room. A server nearby froze beside a table, tray balanced in both hands, unsure whether to move or disappear. Outside, through the wide glass windows, rain traced slow paths. Downward, each droplet catching the city lights before vanishing into the dark. Elijah exhaled slowly, the breath visible only in the subtle rise and fall of his chest. Then, without hurry, he began to lower himself. Not abruptly, not reluctantly, just deliberately. His knee touched the polished wood floor with a soft, almost inaudible sound. Then the other. A ripple moved through the room. Not loud, not dramatic, but undeniable. It was the kind of silence that made people aware of their own breathing. Daniel nodded once, as if restoring order. "Good," he said, stepping slightly to the side, making sure others could see. "Now apologize." Elijah didn't speak. Not yet. His gaze drifted briefly, not toward Daniel, not toward the guests, but toward the far wall, where a framed photograph hung beneath a dim spotlight. It was easy to miss unless you were looking for it. Most people weren't. His fingers moved slowly toward the inside pocket of his coat. The motion was small, almost unnoticeable, but it carried a quiet intention that didn't belong to the moment Daniel thought he controlled. The fabric shifted softly as Elijah reached inside, his hand brushing against something flat, something worn, something that had clearly been carried for a long time. Around him, the restaurant remained frozen in that fragile balance between discomfort and curiosity, as if everyone sensed, without understanding why, that whatever came next would not belong to Daniel Whitmore anymore. Elijah's fingers closed around the object inside his coat, but he did not pull it out yet. Instead, he paused, as if measuring the weight of the moment against something far older than the room, far older than the man standing over him. The polished floor beneath his knees was cool, almost cold, the kind of surface designed to reflect perfection, not the quiet presence of someone like him. Around him, the faint clink of a fork against porcelain sounded too loud, too sharp, like it did not belong anymore. Daniel Whitmore shifted his stance, impatience flickering across his face in a tight movement of his jaw. "I said apologize," he repeated, slower this time, each word spaced like a command he expected to be. Followed without question. A couple seated near the center table exchanged a glance, their expressions uncertain, as if something about the scene had begun to slip out of the neat category of right and wrong they were comfortable with. Elijah lifted his head slightly, just enough for the light above to catch the lines of his face. They were not the lines of defeat. They were the kind that came from years of enduring, of watching, of understanding things most people rushed past. His eyes moved once more across the room, not searching for sympathy, not asking for rescue, but observing. Always observing. The rain outside grew steadier, tapping softly against the glass in a rhythm that felt almost deliberate, like a quiet reminder that time did not stop for moments like this. Daniel took a step closer, the heel of his shoe pressing firmly into the floor, a subtle assertion of control. You walk in here looking like that. You make a mess, and you think you can just stand there? His voice carried, but it no longer filled the room the way it had before. Something had shifted. Not loudly, not dramatically, just enough to be felt. Elijah's hand finally moved. Slowly, carefully, he drew the object from his coat. It was not money. Not anything that would immediately justify his presence in a place like this. It was a photograph. Small, worn at the edges. The kind of wear that came from being held too many times, from being folded and unfolded across years that left their mark without asking permission. He held it between his fingers for a moment, looking at it himself, as if confirming something only he could understand. The overhead light caught the surface, revealing faint scratches across the image, tiny imperfections that made it feel real, lived in. A young server standing near the bar leaned slightly forward, curiosity pulling her attention despite herself. Daniel frowned, his brows drawing together. "What is that supposed to be?" he asked, the sharpness in his tone edged now with something else, something less certain. Elijah did not answer right away. He turned the photograph outward, not toward Daniel first, but toward the space between them, letting it exist in the open air like a quiet interruption to everything that had just happened. A man near the front table squinted slightly, trying to make out the image from where he sat. The restaurant, once filled with layered noise and controlled movement, had become something else entirely. Still, focused, waiting. Elijah's voice, when it came, was low, steady, carrying no anger, no urgency, only a calm that did not need to prove itself. "You ever wonder," he said slowly, "what was here before all this?" The question did not sound like a challenge. It sounded like a memory being offered, or perhaps a door being opened. Daniel's expression tightened, his confidence holding, but just barely. "This is not the time for stories," he replied, though his voice did not land with the same certainty as before. Elijah's gaze did not waver. The photograph remained steady in his hand, the edges trembling only slightly, not from fear, but from something deeper, something tied to time itself. "No," Elijah said quietly, "it is exactly the time." And for the first time since the moment began, the room did not feel like it belonged to Daniel Whitmore anymore. The photograph caught more light as Elijah lifted it slightly higher, the worn surface reflecting a faint glow that seemed almost out of place against the polished perfection of the restaurant. For a moment, no one spoke. Even Daniel Whitmore, who had built his reputation on control and precision, hesitated, his eyes narrowing as he tried to understand why something so small had shifted the entire room. Elijah turned the image just enough for Daniel to see it clearly, not rushing, not forcing, simply allowing the truth to sit where it needed to be. The picture showed a younger man, standing tall in front of a building that looked unmistakably familiar, though simpler, less refined, its edges not yet sharpened by wealth or ambition. A wooden sign hung above the entrance, slightly crooked, the paint still fresh enough to catch the sunlight in the captured moment. The name on that sign was clear, even through the wear of time. Brooks and Whitmore. Daniel's breath did not leave him all at once, but something in his chest tightened, subtle and quiet, like a door he did not realize was closed had just been pushed open. He leaned forward slightly, almost without meaning to, his focus drawn in despite himself. "That does not mean anything," he said, but the words lacked their usual edge, as if they had been spoken a second too late. Elijah watched him, not with satisfaction, not with bitterness, but with a kind of steady patience that made the silence around them feel heavier. "Your father," Elijah said softly, his voice carrying just enough to reach Daniel without needing to rise, "used to stand right there every morning. 6 a.m., before the city woke up. He would wipe down the windows himself." The details settled into the room like dust catching light, small but undeniable. A man near the back shifted in his chair, his attention fully captured now, his earlier distraction forgotten. Elijah continued, his gaze drifting briefly to the photograph again, as if each word pulled something deeper from it. We built it together. Not like this, he added, his eyes flicking once toward the polished bar, the carefully arranged tables, the quiet luxury that now filled the space. Back then, it was just a place for people to sit, to eat, to feel like they belonged somewhere for a little while. Daniel's hand, which had been resting at his side, curled slightly, the fingers tightening without thought. If that were true, he said, slower now, choosing each word as if testing it before letting it go, then why are you out there, and I am in here? The question did not sound cruel. It sounded uncertain. Elijah nodded once, as if he had been waiting for that exact moment. Because time changes things, he replied. And sometimes, people let it. The rain outside pressed harder against the glass, the sound growing just enough to fill the spaces between breaths. A server quietly set down her tray on a nearby table, her movements careful, deliberate, as if she understood that anything louder would break something fragile. Elijah shifted slightly, still on his knees, but no longer appearing small. If anything, the position now felt like a choice rather than a consequence. Your father had vision, Elijah went on. He knew how to see what a place could become, but he also knew it did not belong to just one person. Not back then. Daniel swallowed, the motion subtle but visible, his composure beginning to slip at the edges in a way he could not easily control. You are saying this place was yours? He asked, though the answer was already forming in his mind, piecing itself together with each detail he could no longer ignore. Elijah's eyes met his fully now, steady and unshaken. I am saying, he replied quietly, that before it was yours, before it was his, it was ours. The word lingered, soft but immovable, settling into the room with a weight no raised voice could have carried. And for the first time, Daniel Whitmore did not look like the man in charge of the room. He looked like someone standing in the shadow of a truth he had never been told. The word lingered in the air long after Elijah spoke it, settling into the polished space like something that did not belong but refused to leave. Daniel Whitmore stood still, his shoulders squared out of habit, but the certainty behind that posture had begun to fracture in ways that could not be easily repaired. His eyes dropped briefly to the photograph again, then lifted back to Elijah, searching, calculating, trying to find the flaw that would return everything to order. That is not possible, Daniel said, quieter now, though the firmness in his tone felt practiced rather than real. My father built this place from nothing. I have heard the story my whole life. Elijah did not react to the denial. He simply nodded once, as if acknowledging that the version Daniel carried had always been incomplete. From nothing, Elijah repeated softly, the words carrying a weight that did not need to rise. That is what he told you. The restaurant remained suspended in that fragile silence, every guest now fully aware that they were witnessing something far deeper than a simple misunderstanding. A man near the bar slowly set his glass down, the soft click against the wood echoing louder than it should have. Outside, the rain softened again, the steady rhythm against the windows easing into something quieter, almost reflective. Elijah shifted, his hand slightly, holding the photograph more firmly now, not as evidence, but as something personal, something that had survived long after everything else had changed. Your father and I met when this block looked nothing like it does now, Elijah continued. Back when half these buildings were boarded up and the streetlights flickered more than they worked. We did not have much, just an idea and a belief that if you treated people right, they would come back. His voice carried no resentment, no attempt to reclaim what had been lost, only the calm clarity of someone who had already made peace with the truth. Daniel's expression tightened, his mind moving quickly, connecting fragments he had never questioned before. Then where were you? He asked, the question slipping out before he could reshape it into something stronger. All these years. If any of this were real, you would not be standing here like this. The words hung there, not as an attack, but as a reflection of everything Daniel had been taught to believe. Elijah's gaze softened slightly, not in weakness, but in understanding. Life does not always follow the path people expect, he said. There were decisions made, papers signed, opportunities taken by one and not the other. He paused for a moment, just long enough for the room to lean into the silence again. And some people, he added, choose security over fairness. Daniel's breath slowed, his chest rising and falling in a rhythm that felt heavier than before. "You are saying he took it from you," he said, the words forming carefully, as if speaking them too quickly might make them real in a way he could not control. Elijah did not answer directly. Instead, he looked around the restaurant once more, taking in the polished surfaces, the carefully arranged tables, the quiet luxury that now defined the space. "I am saying," he replied, "that what you see today was not built by one man alone." The statement did not accuse. It revealed, and that made it harder to dismiss. A server near the back shifted her weight, her eyes moving between the two men, caught between the version of reality she had always assumed and the one unfolding in front of her. Daniel ran a hand slowly along the edge of a nearby table, his fingers brushing the smooth surface as if grounding himself in something physical. "Even if what you are saying were true," he said, his voice lower now, stripped of its earlier command, "that does not change what this place is now. It does not change who I am responsible for. I have a business to run." Elijah nodded again, the motion small but deliberate. "And you are running it well," he said. "Clean floors, full tables, everything in its place." His eyes met Daniel's once more, steady and unshaken. "But tell me something," he added quietly. "When did respect become something that had to be demanded instead of given?" The question settled into the room like a final note, soft but impossible to ignore. Daniel did not respond right away. For the first time since this began, he did not have an answer ready. And the silence that followed was not empty. It was full of everything he had never thought to question before. Daniel Whitmore did not answer the question, but the absence of an answer spoke louder than anything he had said before. His hand remained resting on the table, fingers slightly spread as if holding himself steady against something unseen. Around him, the room had shifted completely. The quiet was no longer passive. It was watchful, expectant. A woman near the window slowly lowered her phone, no longer interested in recording, but unable to look away. The air carried a different weight now, something heavier than embarrassment, something closer to truth pressing its way into the open. Elijah remained where he was, still on his knees, but nothing about him felt diminished. If anything, his presence had grown, filling the space in a way that did not rely on volume or authority. Daniel inhaled slowly, his chest rising, then falling with measured control, but the rhythm was not as steady as before. "You are avoiding the point," he said finally, though his voice had softened, the sharp edge worn down by something he could not quite contain. "This is not about philosophy. This is about what just happened here. You walked in, disrupted service, and refused to follow a basic request." The words sounded structured, almost rehearsed, like something he had said many times in different situations, but now they felt thinner, less certain, as if they no longer held the same weight. Elijah listened without interruption, his gaze steady, allowing the explanation to unfold without resistance. "A basic request," Elijah repeated quietly, not mocking, not challenging, simply acknowledging the phrase. He shifted slightly, adjusting his balance, the movement slow and deliberate, as if even the smallest action carried meaning. "Is that what you believe it was?" Daniel's jaw tightened again, the question landing closer than he expected. "It was a matter of order," he replied. "Standards exist for a reason. If I let one person ignore them, then what does that say to everyone else?" A man seated near the bar leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful now, no longer detached. The idea of order, of standards, hung in the air like something familiar, yet suddenly uncertain. Elijah nodded once, his eyes lowering briefly before lifting again. "Standards matter," he said. "They always have. But the question is, who are they meant to protect?" The simplicity of the question cut deeper than any argument. Daniel opened his mouth, then paused, the answer forming but not quite settling. His gaze shifted across the room, catching the faces of guests who were no longer passive observers. They were listening, measuring. The balance of the room had tilted, and he could feel it. "They protect the business," he said after a moment, though the words did not land with the same conviction. "They protect the experience." Elijah's eyes softened again, not in agreement, but in understanding. "And where do people fit into that?" he asked. "Not the ones with reservations. Not the ones who can afford to sit at these tables. The others." He gestured slightly, not toward himself alone, but toward something broader, something beyond the room. The ones who do not look like they belong here. The question settled into Daniel's chest in a way he could not deflect. He glanced once more at the photograph still held in Elijah's hand, the image now impossible to ignore. The younger man in that picture stood with purpose, with ownership, with a quiet pride that felt far removed from the figure kneeling before him now. And yet, the eyes were the same. That realization did not come all at once. It unfolded slowly, like something being revealed layer by layer. Daniel straightened slightly, his posture returning out of instinct, but the authority behind it had shifted. "Even if I accept what you are saying," he began, his voice measured, careful, "it does not change the reality of this moment. You are here now, and I have responsibilities that cannot be ignored." Elijah held his gaze, the calm still unbroken. "And I am not asking you to ignore them," he said. "I am asking you to see them clearly." The distinction hung between them, subtle but powerful. A server near the back took a small step forward, then stopped, uncertain, as if she sensed that something important was unfolding and did not want to interrupt it. The rain outside had nearly stopped now, leaving faint trails on the glass that caught the city lights in soft reflections. The world beyond the windows continued as it always had, but inside, something had shifted in a way that could not be undone. Daniel's hand slowly pulled away from the table, his fingers curling inward as he drew them back to his side. The gesture was small, but it marked a change. Control was no longer absolute. "Then explain it to me," he said quietly, the command gone, replaced by something else, something closer to uncertainty. "Explain what I am supposed to see." Elijah did not rush to answer. He looked down at the photograph once more, then back up at Daniel, his expression steady, grounded, as if the answer had always been there, waiting for the right moment to be heard. And when he finally spoke, his voice carried not just words, but the weight of everything that had led them to this exact point. Elijah did not answer immediately, and that silence stretched just long enough to change the feeling in the room again. It was no longer tense in the same way as before. It was quieter, deeper, like something settling beneath the surface. The soft hum of the overhead lights became noticeable, blending with the faint sound of water still dripping from the edge of the awning outside. Elijah lowered the photograph slightly, not hiding it, but letting it rest against his knee as his hand relaxed around it. His other hand brushed lightly against the floor, fingertips grazing the smooth wood as if recognizing it, as if remembering something no one else in the room could see. Daniel stood still, watching him, waiting, the question he had asked lingering in the space between them. For the first time since this began, he was not trying to control the outcome. He was trying to understand it. Elijah drew in a slow breath, the kind that came from someone who had carried a story for a long time and knew that once spoken, it would not return to silence again. "What you are supposed to see," he said quietly, "is not me." The words landed gently, but they carried something weightier beneath them. A man near the bar leaned forward slightly, his attention fixed, his earlier assumptions now completely gone. Elijah continued, his voice steady, unhurried, each word placed with care. "You are supposed to see the line," he said. "The one that runs through a place like this, even when no one talks about it." Daniel's brow furrowed slightly, not in resistance, but in focus, as if trying to follow something just out of reach. Elijah lifted his hand from the floor and gestured subtly, not toward the tables, not toward the guests, but across the space itself. "It separates who belongs from who does not, who gets welcomed and who gets watched, who gets asked what they would like to order and who gets asked to leave." The distinction did not sound exaggerated. It sounded observed, lived. The room absorbed it without interruption. A server near the back lowered her gaze, her posture shifting in a way that suggested she had seen that line before, even if she had never named it. Elijah's eyes moved slowly back to Daniel. "Tonight, I stepped across that line," he said. "Not loudly, not to make a point, just to exist on the other side of it for a moment." Daniel swallowed again, the motion small but visible, his mind moving through something more complicated than rules or procedures. "And I responded," he said quietly, almost to himself. Elijah nodded. "You enforced it," he replied. "The same way it has always been enforced. With certainty, with confidence, without asking why it is there in the first place." The words did not accuse. They revealed, and that made them harder to dismiss. Daniel's gaze drifted briefly toward the photograph, then back to Elijah, as if the image had become part of the conversation whether he wanted it to or not. "I did what I thought was right," Daniel said, though the statement sounded more like a question now. Elijah did not challenge it. "Most people do," he said. "That is how it continues." The simplicity of the response settled into the room like a quiet truth that no one could argue with. Outside, the rain had fully stopped, leaving the glass clear, the city lights beyond sharper now, more defined. Inside, the reflection of those lights stretched across the floor, broken only by the place where Elijah knelt. He looked down at the photograph again, his thumb brushing lightly across its surface, tracing something familiar. "Your father," he said after a moment. "He used to say this place would only work if people felt seen when they walked in. Not judged, not measured. Seen." Daniel's expression shifted again, something softer moving beneath the surface, something closer to memory than resistance. "He believed that," Elijah added. "At least, in the beginning." The words did not carry bitterness. They carried distance. Time. Daniel's shoulders lowered slightly, the tension he had held beginning to release in ways he could not fully control. "And somewhere along the way," he said slowly, "that changed." Elijah looked up at him, his gaze steady, but there was something else there now, something quieter. "It does not have to stay that way," he said. The statement was not a demand. It was not even a request. It was an opening. And for the first time since the moment began, Daniel Whitmore stood in front of a choice that had nothing to do with policy, nothing to do with image, and everything to do with who he decided to be when no one was telling him what to do. Daniel did not move right away, but something inside him had already begun to shift, subtle at first, like a quiet crack forming beneath a surface that had always seemed solid. His eyes drifted again to the photograph in Elijah's hand, but this time he did not just see an image. He saw details he had ignored before. The way the younger version of his father stood slightly behind Elijah, not in front. The way both men's hands rested on the same wooden beam above the entrance, as if they had lifted it together. The sign above them was not polished or perfect, but it carried something the room around them now seemed to lack. Intention. Daniel's breath slowed, his chest rising deeper this time, as if something inside him was finally making space for a truth that had been waiting for years. "My father never mentioned you," he said quietly, though the words did not sound like a defense anymore. They sounded like a realization. Elijah gave a small nod, not surprised, not offended, just acknowledging what had already been understood. "There are parts of a story people choose not to pass down," he replied. "Not always because they want to lie. Sometimes because they do not know how to explain what they lost along the way." The room absorbed that, the meaning settling deeper than before. A man near the front table leaned back slowly, his gaze no longer fixed on Elijah alone, but shifting toward Daniel, watching how he would respond. Daniel's shoulders lowered another inch, the rigid control he had carried beginning to loosen in ways that felt unfamiliar. He looked around the restaurant, really looked this time, at the guests who had once been part of a controlled environment, now quiet witnesses. At the staff who stood still, unsure, caught between protocol and something far more human. At the polished surfaces that reflected everything except what had just been revealed. And then his gaze returned to Elijah, still on his knees, still calm, still steady. The contrast struck him harder than anything that had been said. Daniel took a slow step forward, then stopped, as if the distance between them had suddenly become something he had to cross carefully, not physically, but internally. "If what you are saying is true," he began, his voice lower, now stripped of command, "then this place, it was never meant to feel like this." The admission was quiet, but it carried weight. Elijah watched him without interruption, allowing the thought to fully form. "No," Elijah said softly. "It was not." The simplicity of the answer left no room to hide. Daniel glanced once more at the photograph, then at the floor beneath Elijah, and something in his expression shifted again, deeper this time, closer to something he could not undo. "Then I have been running it wrong," he said, almost under his breath, the realization landing fully for the first time. A server near the bar exhaled softly, the sound barely audible, but it marked the moment. The room had crossed a line that could not be stepped back over. Elijah did not correct him. He did not confirm it either. He simply held the space, letting Daniel arrive at the truth on his own. "You have been running it the way you were shown," Elijah replied. That is different. Daniel nodded slowly, the distinction settling into him with a clarity that felt both grounding and unsettling. He looked down at his hands, at the same hands that had moments ago pointed, commanded, enforced. They felt heavier now, not with power, with awareness. He drew in a breath, then another, each one steadier than the last, as if he was learning how to stand in a different version of himself. When he looked up again, his eyes no longer held the same certainty, but they held something else instead, something closer to responsibility. And if I want to change that, he said, his voice quiet but clear, where does it start? The question did not belong to the manager of a restaurant. It belonged to a man standing at the edge of something he had never questioned before. Elijah's gaze softened slightly, not with approval, but with recognition. He shifted his weight, still kneeling, but no longer defined by it. It starts, he said slowly, with what you do next. The words settled into the space between them, simple, direct, and impossible to avoid. And for the first time since the moment began, Daniel Whitmore understood that whatever came next would not be about the past, or the photograph, or even the story that had just been uncovered. It would be about the choice he made in this exact moment, in front of everyone who had seen who he was, and were now waiting to see who he would become. Daniel did not speak right away, but the silence that followed his question felt different now, no longer uncertain, no longer defensive, but filled with a quiet weight of decision. His gaze dropped once more to Elijah, still kneeling on the polished floor, still holding that photograph like it carried more than memory, like it carried truth that had finally been allowed to surface. The reflection of the overhead lights stretched across the wood between them, broken only by the space where Elijah remained, and Daniel could not ignore what that image meant anymore. Slowly, almost carefully, Daniel stepped forward again, closing the distance that had once felt natural but now required intention. The sound of his shoes against the floor was soft, but in the stillness of the room, it carried. He stopped just a few feet away, close enough now that he no longer looked down from a place of authority, but stood within the same space. His shoulders lowered, not as a gesture, but as a release, as if something he had been holding for years had finally loosened its grip. Around them, no one moved. No one spoke. Even the quiet background music had faded into something barely noticeable, leaving only the presence of the moment itself. Daniel drew in a breath, deeper than before, steadying himself not for control, but for honesty. His voice, when it came, did not rise. It did not command. It simply existed. You should not be down there, he said quietly. The words were simple, but they carried a meaning that shifted everything they had just lived through. Elijah did not move immediately. He watched Daniel, measuring the words not by their sound, but by their intent. Daniel took another small step forward, his hand lifting slightly before pausing, as if unsure whether the gesture belonged to the man he had been or the man he was becoming. Then, without hesitation, he lowered himself. Not fully, not mirroring the exact position, but enough to remove the distance that had defined the moment before. The movement was subtle, but it rippled through the room like something unexpected, something real. A quiet intake of breath came from somewhere near the back, but no one interrupted. Daniel's eyes met Elijah's directly now, level, no longer separated by height or control. I was wrong, he said. The words did not come easily, but they came clearly, without excuse, without explanation, just truth. Elijah's expression did not change dramatically, but something in his gaze softened, not in forgiveness yet, but in acknowledgement. Daniel continued, his voice steady, grounded in something he had only just begun to understand. Not because of the photograph, he added. Not because of who you were before, but because of who you are standing in front of me right now. The distinction settled into the room with quiet force. It was not about the past anymore. It was about the present, about the moment. Elijah lowered his gaze briefly, then looked back up, his grip on the photograph loosening just slightly, as if the need to hold on to it so tightly had begun to fade. Daniel straightened just enough to shift his weight, but he did not step back. He remained where he was, within that shared space, no longer separated by the invisible line Elijah had described. If this place was meant to make people feel seen, Daniel said slowly, then I failed that tonight. His eyes moved briefly across the room, acknowledging the witnesses, the quiet presence of those who had watched everything unfold before returning to Elijah. And I will not let that be what this place stands for. The statement did not sound like a promise made for others. It sounded like a decision made within. Elijah studied him for a moment longer, the silence stretching again, but this time it carried something lighter, something closer to release than tension. Then, slowly, Elijah began to rise. Not hurried, not dramatic, just a steady movement upward, as if reclaiming a position that had never truly been taken from him. The room seemed to breathe again as he stood, the shift subtle but undeniable. Daniel stepped back half a pace, not retreating, but making space, allowing Elijah to stand fully. Without obstruction, their eyes met once more, now on equal ground, and for the first time since the moment began, there was no imbalance between them. No command, no enforcement, only presence. And in that quiet exchange, something had been restored that no rule, no policy, no authority could ever create on its own. The room did not return to what it had been before. It could not. Something unseen had shifted too deeply for that. The air felt clearer now, lighter, as if a pressure that no one had named had finally been released. Elijah Brooks stood fully upright, his shoulders relaxed, his posture steady, the photograph still resting quietly in his hand, no longer a shield, no longer proof, just a piece of a story that had already done its work. Daniel Whitmore remained in place for a moment longer, his eyes holding Elijah's, not searching anymore, not questioning, just present in a way he had never been before. Then, slowly, Daniel stepped aside. Not dramatically, not for attention, just enough to clear the path in front of Elijah. The gesture was small, almost unnoticeable, but in that moment, it carried more meaning than any apology could have explained. No one in the restaurant spoke. No one needed to. Elijah glanced around once, taking in the faces, the tables, the space that had once drawn a line between him and everyone else. That line no longer felt the same. Not erased, not forgotten, but seen. And that changed everything. He slipped the photograph back into his coat, his fingers pressing lightly against the fabric as if sealing it away again, not out of necessity, but out of closure. Then he turned toward the door. His steps were unhurried, measured, each one quiet against the polished floor, yet somehow louder than anything that had happened before. As he passed the tables, a few guests lowered their eyes, not out of discomfort, but out of reflection, as if they were seeing more than just a man walking by. A server near the entrance straightened slightly, her posture shifting with a subtle respect that had not been there earlier. Elijah did not acknowledge it outwardly, but something in his expression softened just a fraction. At the door he paused. Not long. Just enough to rest his hand briefly against the cool metal handle, feeling the solid weight of it beneath his palm. Outside, the city lights stretched across the wet pavement, reflections shimmering in the thin layer of rain left behind, the night calm and steady as if it had been waiting for him. He opened the door, and a soft rush of cool air moved through the restaurant, carrying with it the quiet sounds of the city beyond. For a brief moment, the inside and the outside existed together, no barrier, no separation, just space. Elijah stepped through. The door closed gently behind him, the sound soft, final, yet not heavy. Inside, Daniel remained where he was, his gaze fixed on the space Elijah had just occupied. The room around him slowly began to move again, chairs shifting, quiet murmurs returning, but nothing felt quite the same. He looked down at his hands once more, then across the room, seeing it not as a manager, not as a figure of control, but as something else entirely. Something that required more than order, more than standards, something that required awareness, responsibility. He took a slow breath, then turned toward the staff, his posture different now, not rigid, not commanding, but grounded. He did not speak immediately. He did not need to. The change had already begun. And outside, under the soft glow of streetlights, Elijah Brooks walked down the sidewalk, his figure moving steadily through the night, the reflections of the city lights stretching ahead of him. He did not look back. He did not need to. The silence behind him said everything that words no longer could.